Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. Today we're going to continue talking about the King's Indian attack. We already discussed the basic setup of the opening. We went into great detail on how to punish knight to f6, and today we're going to learn what to do against g6, bishop to g7, knight g2 e7 system, and we're starting right now. Let's quickly go through the moves. Remember, repetition is key. e4, e6, d3, d5, and do not forget this crucial move here, knight to d2. The idea is that if black captures with the pawn, we have the option of recapturing with the pawn, and now there's not going to be a trade of queens. We have c5, knight g2 f3, knight c6, g3 and g6. This is the main move we're going to cover in this video, and we're going to talk about all the main plans and ideas that both sides, both black and white, are going to have here. We have bishop g2, bishop g7, castles by white, and as you can see, we already have our little scheme. This is the King's Indian attack setup, and black is going to continue with knight g2 e7, and this is going to be the main starting position that we want to analyze to see how we deal with this black setup. So what are the ideas for white? Well, if we look closer at the black position, this time this bishop is on g7 and not on e7 when we talked about the knight to f6 lines. From g7, this bishop does have very good control of the e5 square. So we have to be very careful when we want to push our pawn to e5, because in a lot of cases it will be premature, since the queen can come very fast to c7 and then there will be three pieces attacking that square. Not to mention, one plan for black is to go h6, g5, and knight to g6, and then they will have four pieces attacking there, and it will be very hard for white to get this e5 in. So in order to get e5 in, we have to prepare very, very well. Okay, so e5, that's a plan. We want to get it in, but we have to be careful. Another plan is we need to do something with this knight. So where does this knight belong? In a lot of situations, we want to take on d5, and if the knight captures on d5, we have this very juicy c4 square for our knight. And we're going to put a pawn on a4, that way b5 can never come in and kick it back. That's one idea. Now, if we take on d5 and they capture with the pawn, another great idea is to go knight to b3, and on the next move, we want to go d4, and this is going to create a backwards or at least an isolated pawn on d5 for black that we will be able to target. So that's another idea. This knight can also relocate itself to the king side. The way we do that is by playing a rook to e1, and notice that once it's on e1, then the e5 push can be a little bit easier to make, since this knight is very rapidly coming to f1 and this bishop can get out to f4. Once the knight is already on f1, we can go ahead and play h4, knight to h2, knight to g4. Notice something. This bishop that black has on g7 is a very good protector of the king if black ever castles kingside. So one idea is to be able to trade our dark square bishop for black's dark square bishop, in which case there will be a lot of weaknesses in the dark squares around the black king, and we can take advantage of that and we will be able to attack. All right, so this is white. What about black? What are black's ideas in this situation? Well, we already mentioned one, which is to go for h6, g5, and knight to g6 when this pawn ever gets to the e5 square, and together with queen to c7, there will be a lot of pressure on that pawn. Another thing that black can do in these positions is to go for a very early castle. But doing this is going to actually facilitate the e5 push, because then if you actually go for this h6, g5, you're going to be weakening your king already. So some players don't like to go for this. Another main thing is to go for b6, bishop to b7, or b6, bishop to a6. You can also try the same combination with a b6, a5, and bishop to a6. And I'm going to try to cover all of these maneuvers in this video. So let's jump to our first game. We're going to pick it up from this position, and white went rook to e1. A very flexible move, since black has not committed to doing anything. He hasn't played on the queen side and he hasn't castled yet. So we want to just wait. So rook e1, we still have the ideas of playing e5. We have ideas of playing knight to f1. Let's see what black does. Black castles, so now we have a clear objective. We want to attack the king side. So there's many options now. We have e5, h4, h5. We also have h4, knight to f1, knight h2, knight g4. Remember, This attempts to trade the dark square bishops. That way we have weaknesses in the dark squares that we can attack. And don't forget, we also have the possibility of just simply taking on d5. And if pawn takes, knight to b3 with the idea to play d4. Or if the knight takes, we have the juicy knight to c4 square. So let's see what white played. They went for h4 and h6 by black. White continued with pawn to e5 and queen to c7. The idea of this move is that now there's 3 pieces targeting this pawn, and black and white only has 2. So this forces queen to e2 and g5 by black here. Normally this move works in this position once you have these 3 pieces attacking here, because you're threatening to go g4. But this inclusion of h4 makes this move almost impossible, as you will see. In the game we have pawn takes, knight takes on g5, and this is the plan that black had, was to take on e5. And this almost seems like you have to trade queens, because the black queen is attacking the knight and it's attacking your queen, and you don't have time to play queen to h5 because the queen takes on e1 with check first. So this almost looks as though white is forced to have to trade queens, and if this happens, then this whole maneuver with h6 g5 actually makes a lot of sense, because black has a very good position here since the pawn structure is a lot better. But white has a very nasty move here, and it's knight d to e4. The idea is that if you take my knight, I go queen to h5, I'm threatening checkmate on h7. There's only one way to prevent this, and it's with queen to f5, and then we have bishop e4, and it's going to be game over. Everything's going to be crashing in on h7, and you will have to sacrifice your queen, and it will probably still be checkmate. So you cannot take the knight, and in the game, knight to d4 is played. And again, if we play queen to h5 now, this doesn't work because of queen to f5 actually defends the position. So in the game, instead of this, we have queen to d1, and after f6, this loses to bishop f4. The queen has to go to f5, and after knight to d6, we are forking the queen. We're also hitting the bishop here, so the queen goes to g6, knight took on c8, and after you capture, we go knight takes on e6, knight takes, rook takes, and here black resign. You're down a pawn, your pawn structure is a mess, you're probably going to lose this pawn as well. So it was game over. A quick 20 move win by white, thanks to that very nice resource of knight d to e4. In game 2, again, white goes for rook to e1, but here, instead of castling, black went ahead and played b6. And now, instead of going for h4 and maneuvers of knight to f1 and h2 attacking on the king side, we're going to shift to something else. We're going to go for e takes on d5. And again, there's 2 options here. You can go knight takes and pawn takes. If pawn takes, we go d4, and after c takes on d4, remember, knight to b3, and bishop g4, bishop to g5, castles, bishop takes on e7, knight takes on e7, and after knight b takes on d4, this is a very pleasant position to play with white. There's going to be this isolated d pawn that we're going to be able to target, and this is going to be a very nice game for white to play. In the game, after e takes on d5, we have knight takes on d5, and d4 was played. A very interesting move. If knight takes on d4, we go knight takes on d4, and after bishop takes on d4, we go knight to b3, and black is actually going to be forced to give us this bishop again, because there's going to be a lot of threats here. If this bishop returns back to g7, well, we can go ahead and do both queen takes on d5 or bishop takes on d5, winning a piece, because this king is actually pinned. This pawn cannot take this knight or queen or bishop when it lands there. So you cannot go back with the bishop, and if you leave your bishop there, for example, well, we're always going to have the option of retaking our pawn back, and then you're going to have all those dark square weaknesses. Or better yet, if you do any other weird move, we have this pawn to c3, which is going to force you to get rid of this bishop from here, and again, we're going to be able to take on d5, winning a piece. So this would have been a very dangerous pawn to take with the knight. So in the game, after d4, we have c takes on d4. And the idea is the same. We go knight to b3, and now we have both knights attacking the pawn and the queen as well. So it is very hard to protect it. So black just went ahead and continued his development with bishop to b7. and we went ahead and we took the pawn with the f pawn. Now notice that this bishop on g2 has joined the party and it's going to have a lot to say in this game. The knight took on d4, knight took on d4, and here rook to c8 had to be played. You had to prevent this c4 move from coming. That was the main threat in this position. If this knight moves, then we take the bishop on b7. So rook to c8 was played, but this runs into rook takes on e6 check, and after pawn takes, knight takes, this queen is going to be overloaded. The knight is hitting both the queen and the bishop, and the queen also has to keep the protection of the knight on d5. So something has to give. So the queen went to d7, we took on g7, we check, queen takes, bishop takes on d5, bishop takes and queen takes, and look at this king stuck in the center of the board. This rook is never going to be able to get in, and this bishop is going to come in real fast. This rook is going to be able to come to e1 with a lot of threats. So here, queen to d7 by black. He wants to trade queens. If he trades queens, he might be able to save these positions, because then the open files for the rooks, then they will be able to do something. But here, white says, nah, queen to e5 check. Now I'm hitting your king and the rook at the same time, so you have to go king to f7. That way now the rooks are connected, so you cannot actually go ahead and take them. And bishop to h6 by white. That the threat is a nasty one. You want to go queen to g7 check, and after this king comes out into the e file, we want to bring our other rook into the game and practically checkmate the king or win material. So rook h to g8 had to be played. You had to keep an eye on this square, and rook to e1. Now this threat of the rook and queen coming together, crashing in the king side, is going to be devastating, and black is in a lot of trouble already. The rook came to c5, attacking the queen, but also he wants to serve as a protector here on f5 in some situations. So it does make sense that this move was played in the game. Queen f4, queen came to f5. Again, if you trade queens, this is going to make your defensive task a lot easier. So of course white did not go for that. Queen to e3 is played, and queen back to d7. And believe it or not, this position has been reached in the database over 30 times. I'm not sure how or why people keep playing into this, because it just looks absolutely disgusting to look for, in at least in the black side of it. Here, queen to f3 check, rook to f5, and rook to d1. A very deep move, because if you go for this rook takes on f3, we take, and after king to e6, we get another pawn. It's going to be 3 pawns for the exchange. A very easy way for white to win here. We're just going to go bishop back to e3. We're also targeting this pawn, and then we're going to have this very nice connected 3 pawns here. One of them is going to become a queen, and it's going to be a very easy win. So after rook to d1, black went queen to e7, and this loses to queen b3 check. The queen has to go to e6, and now rook to d7 check. And now this queen cannot take because it's pinned. So the only move to save the queen is king f6. And here, queen to c3, rook to e5, and queen to d4. And this king, you cannot prevent both this rook to d6 pinning the queen, or f4 winning a whole rook. So they went for g5. They tried to save some material. Rook to d6, and after king to e7, this was just game over. After a few moves, the queen took on h7, and black resigned. In this game 3, as we've done so far, we're going to pick it up from this position and rook e1. Again, b6, but instead of going for this e takes on d5 maneuver, we're going to go ahead and do something else, c3. Here, black has many options. If they castle kingside, then we're going to treat this position like we treated the other ones, with the inclusion of h4, e5, and knight to f1, with the maneuver of attacking on the kingside. And if they go bishop b7, then we can go ahead and treat this position with e takes on d5, try to use the maybe open e file together with some pawn to d4 in combination with queen to a4, swinging the queen to the kingside. In this game, black went for a5, and we had to prevent this pawn from moving forward even further, so we go for a4 here and bishop to a6. This move makes some sense because you're targeting a pawn, but this is going to leave this bishop a little bit outside of the game here in this diagonal, and it was probably better to just go for bishop to b7, keeping an eye on this other long diagonal here. The game continued. E takes on d5. Now bishop takes on d3 is not possible because you're hanging your knight. So knight takes on d5, and we use this opportunity to protect our d3 pawn with playing knight to c4. And if you try to take this knight with bishop takes on c4, we take with the pawn, and when this knight leaves to either e7 or f6, we're going to have discoveries with our knight here, knight to g5, maybe even knight to e5, taking advantage of this very long diagonal and the weaknesses created in the way. So instead of capturing the knight, black goes for castle, h4, and the idea is that we want to go for h5 and soften up some of the pawns here on the king side. Queen to c7. I gotta say that going for some h6, in case that they do h5, you can meet that with g5. It was probably a better try, but okay. Queen c7 was played in the game, h5, and now, of course, what we really want for black to do is to capture here, but they're not going to do that. So they went ahead, rook a to d8. Now they do have some ideas here on the d file, so we have to be a little bit careful with bishop takes on c4. So we go queen to e2. We sidestep any tactics that could happen there. Rook f to e8, and we have an exchange of pawns. And due now to this open h file, we're going to have some tactical possibilities here. So white starts with knight to g5. The idea is to go queen e4, queen h4, and start hitting your h7 square. At the moment, even if we put the queen there, it doesn't do a lot, but we're going to little by little start creating some weaknesses there. Black goes for e5. White continue with queen to e4. The bishop returned to b7. Notice that it pretty much didn't do anything there, and taking on c4 was probably not a good idea due to pawn takes. And now when this knight moves, you have both the c6 weak and the queen to h4 threat. So it must have been a very difficult decision to have to return with bishop to b7. Here, queen to h4 by white, knight to f6, preventing any checkmates here on h7, knight to e4, and knight to h7. A very, very pretty move, I gotta say. Very tempting was to go for knight takes on e4, but then after you go pawn takes on e4, white here is just gonna go bishop g5, putting some pressure on the f6 square, not to mention it's already attacking your rook. This knight is going to come to e3, it's going to go to d5, and from here it will be attacking the queen, it will be also targeting the f6 square. It would have been very difficult for black to deal with this position after bishop to g5 and this knight to e3, knight to d5 maneuver. So knight to h7 still keeps an eye on these two penetrating squares, and it is still a very good defender for black in this position. Here, white comes up with a very cool pawn sacrifice and play g4. The idea is that now we want to go rook e3, rook h3, and attack on the h file. So here, black took on d3, we go bishop f1, now this rook has to return, and we go rook e3. The knight goes to d8, and this was the decisive mistake of the game. But it was still a very difficult position to play with black. Rook to h3, now we're ready to take on h7. So bishop takes on e4, queen takes on h7, king to f8, and bishop to h6. We want to remove the last defender around this king. f6, now this does give some protection along the 7th rank here. Rook to e1, attacking the bishop. Queen to b7, it protects, and here g5. And after pawn takes, we go queen to h8, and in this position, black resigned. The king is getting checkmated after king to e7, queen takes, and I'm just going to show you the moves because it is just a forced checkmate on queen to g3. For more content, check one of the videos on the screen. As always, stay safe, have a great day, show respect to your opponent. See you on the next video.